At any rate, it was quite obvious that, as one journalist put it, the post-Holocaust honeymoon was over. Of course, we know there really wasn't a post-Holocaust honeymoon. If anybody had been paying attention to Cambodia, Rwanda, and I can go on. So one morning I turned to my husband, Jamie, and I poked him. He was asleep. I said, I have to do something. He said, what? I have to do something. He said, okay, no, I really have to do something. And I looked for a group to work with, and there weren't any. I found someone else who was as crazy as I was. She wrote literature, and I walked up and down Mass Ave in Arlington handing out leaflets. And I had a 6-month-old in my backpack, and I was pushing a 24-month-old, and people looked at me, you know, that look of fear, like you're going to ask for money. And I thought, oh, Sherry, don't be stupid. You went to Antioch. You can deal with this better. And I went to my synagogue, and I said, we have to do something. And you can turn on the slides now, Jude. And what we did was we reached out. This is a picture of a refugee camp, excuse me. We reached out to local synagogues, to the churches, to the mosques, to the hospitals, to the schools. Through our synagogue, we held a relief drive where we collected 17.5 tons of aid. I had found someone who was going to ship the aid to the former Yugoslavia. And after we had collected a 40-foot container full of stuff, I found out that this person who was going to distribute it in Croatia wanted $5,000 for the distribution. And I said, I don't think so. And by that time, I had made some pretty good connections with relief agencies. And we ended up shipping this particular container to the International Rescue Committee, which I trust very much. We sent a ton of wool and knitting supplies to a refugee camp in Slovenia. And this is the refugee camp. You can see that there are no young men at this refugee camp, mostly kids and widows, a few older men. And this is a kid from Bosnia who escaped and got to London, and he came back to help the elderly Jewish residents in this small town. The woman that he's sitting next to, she and her cousin were the only 2 members of their family who survived the Second World War. They jumped off a train that was transporting them to one of the concentration camps. They were captured by a local and forced to work as maids and other things for this gentleman throughout the war. And here she is again as a refugee. And Peter was great. His shirt says, AIDS kills, don't be silly, cover your willy. This is a group of the mothers from Sarajevo. They managed, the Jewish community in the former Yugoslavia was very connected, and there were camps here and resorts there, not resorts so much, but this was a little camp that they had in Croatia. And during a ceasefire that summer, they allowed 30 of the women to leave Sarajevo. They had sent many of their children to Israel early in the war. And they hadn't seen their children since the war started in '92. This is the summer of '94. And they got permission to go to Israel to visit their children, provided they came home. Of course, none of the husbands were allowed out of Sarajevo. And I spent some time with them, I spent a day with them. They were great. I don't speak any Serbo-Croatian other than Nema veze, which means never mind. Nema veze is like the national anthem. And if any of you followed Bosnia, you would have just yelled at me for saying Serbo-Croatian instead of Bosnian, but it's one of the things that's still bickered over. Anyway, I don't speak anything, and they didn't speak English. So one of the women, whose family had been in Sarajevo since the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, spoke Ladino. And in my very bad Spanish and her fractured Spanish, we were able to communicate, which I think is just wild. If either of us had been real Spanish speakers, I'm sure we wouldn't have known what the other was saying. And I'll tell you a little bit more about these women as we go on. Oh, this is a great picture. This is one of the husbands, and he's holding a hen. He's an engineer. When the war happened in Sarajevo, there were no more jobs, there was no money, there was no electricity, everything fell apart. And so what he did the second year was he got 4 chicks. One of them was a rooster. I don't think the rooster lived long. But they took the eggs that the chicks laid and they could sell them on the black market for 5 Deutschmarks a day. The Deutschmark was the currency. And so we were laughing about how it was more economically advantageous to have a chicken than an engineer husband. Now, these guys were great. This was a crazy group of guys from Australia. They called themselves Serious Road Trip. And if you remember, in the early parts of the war, Bosnia was completely cut off, on one side by the Croats, on the other side by the Serbs. And it was almost impossible to get aid in. And so what they did was they had these giant trucks painted yellow with Daffy Duck and whoever else, and they would bring in cases of whiskey and cigarettes. And they would bribe the guards at the various checkpoints with whiskey and cigarettes, and they were able to get the food and medical supplies through. And they had a sign on their trucks in the windows that said, "Bigger balls than most." Now, this is Zagreb. This is the airport in Zagreb where the UN had lots of aid for Sarajevo, but it sat there basically. It couldn't go anywhere because it was really up to armed extremists as to whether or not anything could get into Sarajevo. So what I did with Hadassah is we collected, by this time I had learned what to collect that the State Department and Defense Department would ship. Medical supplies, certain types of clothing, blankets, hospital supplies, pharmaceuticals. We collected 23 tons of goods. We got it to, the State Department worked with us, the Defense Department flew it to Ancona, Italy. We waited until things were flown from Ancona, Italy. Someone from the State Department helped us get things flown through the blockade into Sarajevo. And then after we knew that it had gotten there, another woman from Hadassah, Elsie Roth, and I went to join the supplies. And I have to say that one of the great things that Hadassah did, was send us with the stuff, because many people of goodwill went to Bosnia and promised help. And it's not so easy to get stuff into a war zone. It really is kind of a pain. And so we went back to show people that Hadassah keeps its word. Now, traveling into Sarajevo during the war was really very surreal, and also for me, very charmed. It seemed like somebody was watching over us. Not anyone could get into Bosnia, and fewer could get out. In order to fly on the UN airlift, essentially the only way in and out of Sarajevo, other than walking over Mount Igman, we had to get ID cards from the UN, flak jackets, and helmets. We climbed into the tail of a Russian Ilyushin-76 cargo plane, which is like a C-130. It was flown by a Ukrainian crew. If you've never been in one of these planes, there are no bathrooms, no peanuts. The legroom on our first trip was taken up by cargo containers. The seats are jump seats that hang off the walls with big red straps, just like in the movies. There are 2 small round windows on each side of the plane. Elsie and I each slept 4 or 5 bags loaded with gifts from Bosnians that we know in the U.S. to take to their families in Sarajevo: clothing, underwear, pictures, and money. We had thousands of dollars on each of us hidden from people in the U.S. to deliver to their family members in Sarajevo. No one was allowed to bring money into Bosnia. And if we had been found, I don't know what would have happened, but I wasn't thinking about it then, so why now? It would have been not pretty. Now, here we are in Sarajevo. You can see why I knew the other one was in Zagreb and not Sarajevo. Sarajevo, the stuff was just out. It was muddy. It was really a wreck. The UN troops affectionately call the flights into Sarajevo maybe airlines. Maybe the airport will be open and maybe it won't. Maybe the plane will be shot at and maybe it won't. The beginning of the war, they even stamped a maybe airlines visa into people's passports until it became a sort of adventurous status symbol. The planes would fly at a very high altitude until they're nearly over the city, and then they dive for a landing. It's during the descent when the planes are shot at. 2 journalists, Elsie and I, were the only civilians on a plane full of young, fresh UN troops. This is when I finally had some compassion for the poor UN kids. They were kids. When the plane begins its steep descent, the kids nervously fastened their flak jackets, donned their helmets, and grabbed their rifles as if holding a weapon tightly was going to protect you. And they yelled at me for not putting on my helmet. I said, I'll sit on it. It will protect where the bullet's going to come from, but... When the plane landed at the airport, it sped to the ruined sandbag terminal. The tail was dropped, and we were rushed off the plane to get us away from snipers. Immediately, an unfamiliar voice called out, this is the airport, Elsie, Sherry? It was the local AP camera photographer and the video cameraman who would accompany us on all of our appointments. The plane was unloaded and it left in 15 minutes. We were stuck. We were met by Bronco, the La Benevolencia driver. This is my favorite this is my glamour shot in my flak jacket. We were met by Bronco, who drove us first through the French checkpoint. And then we had a frightening few minutes at the Serbian checkpoint, and eventually through the Bosnian checkpoint. These are what you see. These are pictures that I took out the window of the Jeep that we were driving in. The Bosnian checkpoint was just a card table in the middle of the road. We drove by all of these devastated neighborhoods. Some people were still living in some of those houses. This is Oslobođenje, which was the Bosnian newspaper, which continued to publish for the first 2 years of the war. It was a special target. Oslobođenje means liberation. This is Oslobođenje. The journalists published from the basement. And there we are on the other side of Oslobođenje. This is Sniper's Alley. If you remember reports on the war, this is like the main drag, and the yellow building is the Holiday Inn. Remember the 2 buildings behind it, we'll see those again. But you can see the burned out windows, and this is 11 o'clock in the morning of a fairly major city. This is the Miljačka River, which divides Sarajevo in half. That's the post office. It may be again. These are a group of friends of mine who were friendly with my writer friend Sharon Gartenberg. They're all ham radio operators. And this is right in front of the biggest synagogue in Sarajevo, which had a radio tower, and they would come and run it, and this is how people could get information in and out. This is an elderly gentleman who was an ophthalmologist. His 2 sons are both physicians in the United States. One's in Santa Barbara, and I forget where the other one is. They couldn't get their dad out. There was nothing they could do to get him out, and they were just heartbroken. He was one of the people we brought money to.